I've been writing, talking on TV for 25 years. I've had a certain amount of nasty stuff said about me, particularly on social media.
My CNN colleague, Fareed Zakaria, has been the most prominent Muslim journalist on American televisions for more than 2 decades. At times, that's made him an obvious target for bigotry.
The 2 moments where it really flared up were after 9/11 was the first one. People looked at me as a Muslim and, okay, some of that happened.
But Fareed says that burst of hatred was short-lived, thanks to a gesture from the White House.
It turned very quickly because the President of the United States, George Bush, whatever his flaws, was extraordinarily good about saying this is not about Islam. Islam is a good religion.
He famously visited the mosque.
He visited the mosque 2 days after or something like that, 9/11.
The face of terror is not the true faith of Islam. That's not what Islam is all about. Islam is peace.
It made a huge difference. It brought the temperature down.
Then Donald J. Trump came along.
The second time was 2015, 2016, when Trump was running. And Trump did exactly the opposite. He inflamed everybody. There wasn't even a 9/11, but he started to talk about how Islam is a religion of violence. They hate us. I'm going to ban them all, the Muslim ban, all that.
We have to be extremely careful with radical Islamic terrorism. And we have to look at the Muslims and we have to do something. We cannot stand by and be the stupid people while our country is destroyed.
If you judge by the number of personal nasty attacks I got, on Twitter, on social media, calls to my house. My daughters were young then, and they got scared out of their wits. And there was a question of whether or not I needed security and all that just because a presidential candidate decided to, in a sense, give people permission to be nasty, to be bigoted. We all have within us, I think, a dark side and other sides. And leaders can bring out the best in you or they can bring out the worst.
These days, a lot of leaders are bringing out the worst. Around the world, politicians are whipping up people's hatred, anger, and resentment. And they're using it to take down the powers that be. They're going after the establishment that has run much of the world for decades. For Fareed, Trump is just the American face of that global backlash.
In Argentina, a chainsaw-wielding outsider has won their presidential election.
A politician dubbed the Dutch Donald Trump, winning the Netherlands parliamentary elections in a massive landslide.
The Italians have chosen their first far-right government since World War II.
They all have one thing in common. They're against the establishment.
What's so worrying to Fareed is that in most of these countries, the establishment is liberal democracy, a system he believes has brought the world unparalleled safety, prosperity, and freedom.
Clearly, the very fact that it's happening all over the world at the same time tells you that there is a demand for a certain kind of revolt, a certain backlash. This is not a flash in the pan.
He spent most of the past decade trying to figure out why people would want to topple that system. And he's written an excellent, deeply researched book about what he learned. It's called Age of Revolutions: Progress and Backlash from 1600 to the Present. It's about the long rise and maybe the coming downfall of liberal democracy.
We're now getting a new breed of leaders who are telling us they know the answer and who are telling us, we don't like all these constraints, all these checks and balances. It's a bad road.
I'll ask Fareed why and where liberal democracy is under threat, why he thinks it's always been more vulnerable than we realize, and what can be done to shore up the system that Fareed argues has made life so much better for so many of us. I'm Peter Bergen, and this is In the Room. Well, your book covers half a millennium. You have a very busy day job, in fact, day jobs, plural. Your CNN show, Washington Post op-eds, CNN pieces, CNN documentaries. So how did you kind of go about writing this book? And what's your process?
It was very hard. This was probably the hardest book that I wrote. It took me 10 years. I did write 2 books along the way. And as you say, put out a show every week and a column every week and all that. My biggest problem is I'd start work on Monday at like 6 a.m. and have to stop at 8 a.m. And then the next day I would, it took me a while to get my juices flowing. And I had to find a way around that. One of the tricks I learned was from reading an interview with Ernest Hemingway, who said, whenever you're writing and you're on a roll and you're going to stop, don't stop when you've finished writing everything you have to say. Stop one paragraph before that. Because the hardest thing to do is to get going.
Oh, well, that's a good.
And the next day when you get up and you have to get going, you already have your first paragraph. And I would sometimes scribble it in a quick, couple of key words. And that second day then starts with some propulsion and you can kind of keep moving. So I had all kinds of little tricks like that because I know this sounds weird, but thinking is the hardest thing to do. Reading is easy, researching is easy. But the thinking, which allows you to construct a narrative, is the hardest thing.
You mentioned 6 a.m., and I think there's a reason that people often write in the morning, because I think your subconscious has been working on the book in your head while you've been sleeping.
That's a very interesting idea. Yeah, I think you're right.
I really feel that very strongly. I get up as early as I can and start writing.
So it's so interesting you say that. I find that early in the morning, you're right. You've been thinking, cogitating, and it's been sitting in your head all night. And it somehow comes out much, much better, much more fluently, actually.
In his new book, Fareed skillfully compresses a lot of history to tell the story of the rise of liberal democracies. And he emphasizes that there was a lot of luck along the way to make that happen. I talked to Fareed mostly about what's happening in the world right now, but his book really starts back in the 16th century. Fareed describes how, on the waterlogged plains of the Netherlands, the Dutch banded together to save their land from the encroaching seas. Thanks to these very particular circumstances, the Dutch created something that looked quite different from the feudal regimes around them. A tax-based society that built dikes to keep back the rising waters. This in turn helped create an entrepreneurial social order that was far more equal than the rest of Europe. And it bred a unity that encouraged the Dutch to throw off their foreign kings and replace them with a homegrown republic. And by a serendipitous twist of fate, a Dutch ruler, William of Orange, took the crown of England in 1688 and fostered Dutch democratic ideals there. From England, ideas of liberalism spread to the American colonies and around the world. At its heart, the liberal ideal has meant democracy, free trade, equal rights, and maximizing human choice.
The great liberals' conception was always, you get to pick your idea of happiness. When Jefferson says in the Declaration of Independence that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are the core values, what he's really saying is, you don't have to ask a church or a king or a commissar what the good life is. You get to pick it. And as long as your conception of the good life doesn't interfere with other people's conceptions, that doesn't do violence to them, you can do whatever you want. And that's, I think, always been the great promise of liberalism. We promise you that you have the right to live a virtuous life or to live whatever kind of life you want.
The first half of Fareed's book is the story of the rise of that liberal democratic ideal from those obscure 16th century Dutch origins to a worldview that seemed to rule the world. It beat out feudalism, it beat fascism, it beat communism, and won the Cold War. But in the later chapters, Fareed turns to the threats that liberal democracy faces today.
The populists have the wind behind their sails. Trump is leading in the polls. Marine Le Pen is leading in the parliamentary polls in France. Look at Latin American elections in the last 2 years. Everyone who's won has been anti-establishment. Sometimes they're from the left, and sometimes they're from the right, like the crazy guy Milei in Argentina. Geert Wilders won the Dutch election, another right-wing populist.
The way Fareed sees it, right versus left, is no longer the main political battle. These days, elections are being fought over a completely new set of divides.
Left and right was the classic definition of 20th century politics. And it revolved around the economy, the state's role in the economy. Those on the left wanted more taxes, more regulation, more redistribution. Those on the right wanted lower taxes, less regulation, less redistribution. it's no longer a particularly useful way of thinking about the world, because if you think about it, most of the populist parties around that are now called right-wing, they're in favor of a big state. They're in favor of lots of spending. They're not particularly in favor of low taxes. The issues they care about, the new divide, is open versus closed. Do you want a society that is open capital, open information, open in terms of multiculturalism and diversity, open in terms of trade and technology? Or are you very suspicious of all this and do you want a more closed society, more protectionism, more nationalism, more cultural chauvinism, less diversity, less multiculturalism? That's the big divide.
And in many cases, the leaders that are pushing for more closed, inward versions of their countries are going after democracy too. In Hungary, Viktor Orban has muzzled independent media and is building effectively a one-party state. Tunisia's president has jailed his critics and ripped up the democratic institutions that had made his country the Arab Spring's sole success story. Likewise, the leaders of India, Turkey, and a host of many other countries are all consolidating their own power. All this means a rise in what Fareed terms illiberal democracy. By the way, that's a term that he coined.
You are seeing in certain societies around the world the reality of reasonably democratic procedures, free elections that are, let's say, mostly fair, governments that are mostly popular, yet that undermine individual rights, individual liberties, separations of church and state, undermine independent institutions like the media, judiciary, and such. And that's why I say it's not liberal democracy, but it's illiberal democracy. It has the democratic wrapping, but without the inner stuffing, without the core of values and rights and protections.
And that weakening of democracy, combined with the trend towards countries becoming more closed off, more nationalistic, think the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, or the United States waging a trade war with China. That pair of trends is a deep threat to Fareed's idea of how the world should work. But a key point of Fareed's book is that liberalism has always been a lot more fragile than people imagine. With the right conditions and a lot of luck, it has thrived. But there's always been rival systems trying to snuff it out or knock it off track. The rise of the Soviet Union was more than just a little speed bump.
Russia might well have had a very different trajectory if you had not had what was essentially a palace coup in 1917, where the Bolsheviks took over and plunged that country in a totalitarian nightmare for 70 years. So there's also been very significant backtracking. So I think there are many, many times when these things have moved badly or we got there by the skin of our teeth.
Much of your writing is about the fragility of this liberty project. And I think of Weimar Germany as being one of the most liberal, greatest artistic freedom, comparatively speaking for the time, democratic, and we know where that ended.
Important point, but most people don't realize this, Peter. If you had to choose any point in the 20th century to have been gay, Weimar Germany was probably the best place you could have been. If you were to choose in 1930 whether to be a Jew in Germany or a black in America, it wasn't even close. A Jew in Germany could be a judge, a banker, a parliamentarian, a mayor. Blacks in America were still basically, quasi-slaves in the South. So it can turn really fast. And that society from 1930 moves to a place by 1936 that's unrecognizable. And that's about the fragility of democracy. That's about the power of these emotional movements.
You quote at some length Isaiah Berlin. Why him, and what was the point he was trying to make?
So Isaiah Berlin is a slightly forgotten figure now, but was a dominant intellectual in the 70s, 80s.
Born to a Jewish family early in the 20th century in what was then the Russian Empire, as a young boy, Isaiah Berlin lived through the chaos of the Russian Revolution. His family then fled to the United Kingdom, and Berlin eventually worked for the British government when it was fighting the Nazis. After the war, Berlin became a political philosopher, and he was always deeply suspicious of those ideologies that claimed that they had found the answer to create utopia right here on Earth, whether that answer was the dictatorship of the proletariat or the 1,000-year Reich. And surveying the slaughterhouse of the 20th century, Berlin had good reason to be skeptical of the claims of these political religions.
He understood that in an ideological contest between communism and democracy, what communism was offering was something very seductive. And what Berlin says is, don't fall for that trap. Don't fall for those kind of systems that promise you that they can figure out what the best life is. They know the truth. They know the good life. They know how to make your life better. And Berlin was sort of reminding people of that be wary of people who promise you the answer.
The answer usually comes with a ton of body bags, right?
Historically, when political leaders have said they know the answer, generally speaking, what they're saying is, and those who have the wrong answers, we have to get rid of, whether through a counter-inquisition, whether through a war, whether through purges. You will damn well live that good life, or you will be killed or imprisoned, and you will be turned into second-class citizens at the very least.
And of course, in your book, you deal with the terror in the French Revolution, which is the origin of the word terrorism, where 17,000 people, I think you say in your book, went to the guillotine because some people thought they knew the truth and these others didn't.
It's something we forget in today's modern world, that the achievement of liberalism, of classical liberalism, of Enlightenment liberalism, liberal democracy, has been to say that kind of state-directed, religion-directed, ideology-directed imposition of virtue, imposition of the meaning of life is deeply dangerous, is bloody, is violent, and that we're happy to live in societies where the government admits we don't have the answer.
And Fareed's argument is that that's being taken for granted. The people in democracies all around the world are losing sight of how ugly the alternatives can be.
We're now getting a new breed of leaders who are telling us they know the answer, and who are telling us, we don't like all these constraints, all these checks and balances. We're going to give you your share of the spoils. It's a bad road.
With more humans voting in elections around the world in 2024 than at any time in human history, this year could push the world further down that road. One of the year's most important elections just wrapped up in Fareed's birthplace, India. When we spoke, voting was still going on, and Narendra Modi looked set to take a third term as Prime Minister, which he did, although not in the landslide that some had predicted. Modi will lead India for 5 more years, even though he's become a model for the kind of illiberalism that Fareed deplores.
India today has to be described as an illiberal democracy because there's virtually no independent media, particularly television. There's very compromised judiciary, compromised institutions, and there's some question as to whether or not you could even call the elections completely free or fair.
Modi has used his popularity and his position to move in an increasingly authoritarian direction.
His second term in power has been marked by deepening religious polarization and increasing Islamophobia.
It's a tough package to swallow for somebody like me who grew up in India, felt enormous pride that India, even though a very poor country, was still very democratic.
You've been in the room with Modi. You've interviewed him. What's it like to be in the room? And is he turning India away from its secular roots and constitutional roots into a Hindu first state with all that implies?
Modi is not, he's not a dictator. He's not somebody who comes across that way. He's a charming man. He's very intelligent. He's very articulate. And he has a connection with the masses. There's no question about it. But I think that what Modi represents is something that I find more troubling and more worrying, which is Modi doesn't care about the kind of checks and balances of liberal democratic life. He's never given a press conference in his entire decade as prime minister. He routinely flouts the norms and conventions of liberal democracy. And he has, without question, created an atmosphere in which there are first-class citizens and second-class citizens, and India's Muslims, 200 million of them, are second-class citizens.
Mr. Modi said if the opposition Congress is voted back into power, it would distribute citizens' wealth among infiltrators and those who have more children, referring to Muslims in India.
Now, what's more worrying about it is not that he does it, but that it works. There's a large part of the public that is not bought into liberal democratic values, that is comfortable with a certain kind of majoritarianism, nationalism, treating minorities as second-class citizens. He uses his power to get what he wants. In many ways, I think of Trump similarly. I don't think Donald Trump has a kind of plan to be a dictator, but he wants to do what he wants to do. And if democratic norms and rules will stand in the way, well, he'll break them.
Like Modi, Trump has flirted both with going after political opponents.
Somebody wants to run against me. I call my attorney general. I say, listen, indict him.
And with exploiting divisions among Americans for his own gain.
We have some bad hombres here, and we're going to get them out.
Speaking of Trump, you wrote a recent op-ed essentially saying, in almost every swing state, Trump is essentially winning, and you better get used to it. How did people react to this op-ed?
So it went viral. It was fascinating because I thought I was stating just facts. I think it's because people are coming to realize that, it's a bit of what we were talking about with India. There are a lot of people who buy into Trump's populism. There are a lot of people who don't care that he has proved to be anti-democratic. January 6th, the flouting of court orders, the flouting of, search warrants, all of that illiberalism. People don't like Trump despite that. They like him because of that.
There's another leader that Fareed worries is weakening his country's democracy, Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu's been prime minister there for 13 of the past 15 years. While all eyes are on the war in Gaza at the moment, in the time leading up to it, Netanyahu had been clinging to power in ways that echo other anti-democratic leaders. He tried using his position to dodge corruption cases against him, and he also pursued a plan to dramatically weaken Israel's independent judiciary. And then came Hamas's attack on October 7th, Israel's many months of brutal retaliation, and global criticism of Netanyahu's handling of the war.
Sun Tzu said, "Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat." And it seems pretty clear to me that Netanyahu has no strategy for what he's doing. There's no plan for the day after. His own defense minister is kind of criticizing him publicly, which is extraordinary. Do you see any plan?
No, I think you put it exactly right. It's tactics without strategy, but there's a reason behind it. There is a strategy, and the strategy is keep Bibi Netanyahu prime minister. So the problem here is that anything Netanyahu does to move towards some kind of post-war thinking even forces him to make choices which would make him lose some of the crazy right-wingers who support him, right? Because any move towards any greater rights for Palestinians, anything like that, means he loses those two cabinet members on his right. And if he loses them, he has to hold elections.
Is Zionism no longer a sort of liberal project because of the influence of Netanyahu?
It's a very interesting and actually important question, because I think that one of the things you're seeing on college campuses is a real debate. I mean, outside of the craziness and putting up tents where you're not allowed to and all that, there is an issue that's an important and interesting issue, which is, can Zionism be reconciled with liberalism? Because Zionism is a nationalism based on a religion, which normally you'd think is tough for liberalism to reconcile with. And the way Zionism got around that was that I think that, first of all, Jews had been persecuted for 3,000 years, and I think it is perfectly appropriate to say, you know what, guys, we're going to make an exception in this case. These guys get to have their own state, and it's based on the idea of religion because they need a haven. There have been too many pogroms and too many, before you even get to the Holocaust. And I think that's completely right. But the second piece of it was that Zionism in its early practice was commendably liberal. Liberal Jews who decide to be scrupulous about, rule of law and democracy and liberty and setting up a state that has all kinds of liberal, democratic, constitutional features. I think that was all true. What happens is after 1967, you get the occupation of these lands. And with the lands come the people.
In the 1967 war against neighboring Arab states, Israel captured territory that it still controls today, but it's never formally incorporated into Israel. That territory includes the West Bank and Gaza and the millions of Palestinians who live there.
This is what David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, the founding prime minister of Israel, warned against. And this is why he said, give back the territories. And he was right. Because once you take territories and you have people who you rule there, you face a terrible dilemma. Either you give these people political rights, in which case Israel will no longer have a fundamentally Jewish character, or you rule over them like a colonial power. You know, Israel today is in an unusual dilemma, which is it has these people under its control whom it will neither enfranchise nor give their own state. That's almost unique in the modern world. I mean, when the Russians take over parts of Ukraine, the first thing Putin does is gives those people passports, and he says, you're Russian citizens now. The Palestinians, you know, this is the colonial dilemma. You know, this is what my parents used to talk about British India, which is you won't enfranchise us and you won't give us our own country. And that dilemma is cracking liberal Zionism, because you know it's very hard to maintain that as an ideologically coherent idea, which is why I think until Israel solves the problem of its Palestinian occupation, it will face this challenge. Netanyahu is, in a sense, an expression of this reality, and a dark expression of it. And it's why you're seeing this college strife, because the older generation of Jews, if you will, the parents of many of the kids on college campuses, remember Israel as a heroic project. And they think of it as the David against the Goliath of the Arabs. In 48, they tried to essentially exterminate Israel. They fail. In 67, they try. In 73, they try. But what the young people have seen is 20 years of Bibi's government, Bibi Netanyahu, which is, you know, occupation, confiscation of land, imprisonment of people without trials, all that stuff.
What you often hear in the United States is, well, Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East. Now, I think that's factually inaccurate, because I think Iraq and Lebanon are both democracies, imperfect ones. But is Israel one more example of this democratic backsliding that you write about?
Without any question. Look, I mean, even in Israel, people would tell you that there's a great danger Israel is becoming an illiberal democracy. The way I would put it is Israel is an extraordinary democracy still, but it is also ruling over a subjugated people. You know, I mean, it's possible to do both. Britain in the 1920s and 30s was an extraordinary democracy, but it's also true that it was treating its Indian and Kenyan and Nigerian citizens as subjects, not as citizens. And that is the reality that Israel is in today. The 5 million Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza are effectively colonial subjects of Israel.
Fareed argues that part of liberalism's problem is that it's just been too successful for its own good. It brought huge, rapid change to the world, especially in the 20th century, but in ways that primed a backlash. Its secular influence loosened people's connections to religion and tradition. Its commitment to free trade sent jobs overseas or led people to cross borders to find work. It brought a lot of prosperity, safety, and liberty to the world, but not to everyone equally. And the people who didn't gain as much or who feel pushed aside by all this change, in democracies, those people get to vote too. And they're making their anger clear.
And it's a cultural reaction. It's a class reaction at some level against a kind of cosmopolitan, liberal, technocratic, meritocratic elite that has prospered and run the world for the last 3 or 4 decades. And there's no denying that. The people who have been at the center of societies, of most societies around the world, certainly rich societies, have been people who have been urban, cosmopolitan, multicultural, highly educated. And I think we don't realize that there's a large group of people in every society who deeply resent those people, who deeply resent us.
There was this kind of consensus that emerged. You know, these people weren't elected to office, let's say running the World Trade Organization or setting the kind of standards that have existed in the global economy that have left people behind, or people feel left behind.
The effect of all these policies was indeed, as you say, to empower a group of liberal, technocratic, educated elites. And there was a certain condescension towards the others. I've often wondered, mostly meritocracy is a good thing, right? My daughter, who's now 20, worked at a restaurant when she was 14, I think. And she came back after a couple of weeks in the restaurant, and I was talking to her and said, what did you learn? First time she'd ever had a job. And she said, Daddy, the thing about it was, and I don't understand this, the people who work hardest at the restaurant get paid the least. She said the busboys who wash the dishes, they work so hard, they don't have time to take a bathroom break. And they get paid the least. And the guy who opens the bottles of wine, she said every 20 minutes he opens a bottle of wine, and he's like the most highly paid person in the restaurant. And I thought to myself, you're seeing something very symbolic and telling about life, in a weird way, it is a meritocratic system. The wine probably is the highest margin product that the restaurant is selling, and they're probably making the most money on it. And those guys are trained and have skills and harder to get in the market. But it's sad, and it's,
Also, people tend to undervalue the role that luck plays in their own lives.
Luck has an enormous part to play here. A lot of why I made it, why you made it, why, the top bankers have made it, had a lot to do with luck. The luck of where you were born, the luck of who your parents were, the luck of the lucky break you got. There's so many points in my life where I got a lucky break. But, we all tend to downplay that, and we are all the heroes of our own stories. And the other is to forget about how much bad luck played a role in the people who didn't make it.
The question is, what can anyone do about all this? If there are parts of our particular meritocracy that are, ironically, quite unfair, how do we fix them?
We should be looking at the distance traveled, not the destination reached. It's one of the biggest mistakes I've made in hiring over the years has been that. I've been impressed by the shiny Princeton resume and less impressed by the kid who went to UT Austin, but was the first kid in his or her family to go there. And thinking about that trajectory and what it took to get from where that person got to UT Austin was a better predictor that they're going to go far in life. And so I think we all need to be thinking like that much more and being a whole lot less smug than we are.
I mean, that is a very good solution to a particular set of problems, which is how do people access the best institutions in a more democratic way with a small d. But what are some other solutions that you think might be helpful to kind of bridge the gaps or roll back the democratic backsliding and some of the problems that you outline in the book?
I think we need a much more level playing field in American society in a much more kind of radical way than we think about. So, for example, I think we should be thinking a lot about, legacy admissions. I mean, when I went to Yale, the endowment was $1 billion, I think. It's now something like $40 billion. They've expanded the student body 15%. The endowment has gone up 40-fold, and they've expanded it 15%. And Harvard hasn't even expanded it. It's unconscionable. What are they doing? We should be trying to ask ourselves, how do we break open the doors? How do we increase access? I think that in some of these areas, Northern Europe does a lot better than we do. And you can see it in the data. Social mobility in Northern Europe, even in Canada, is now higher than the United States. That's a shame, because if people think of what they thought the American dream was about, it was about that social mobility.
Well, that's fascinating, because that is the American dream. And if that is sort of being turned off to some degree, that's very sad.
The other piece in terms of how do you create a greater sense of national unity, how do you bridge some of these divides of culture, class, money? And one of the things that clearly bound people together the most was the army. If you listen to people who went through World War II or the Korean War, it seems to have been a huge bonding experience. It was an incredible array of different occupations, rich, poor, east, west, all coming together. And universal national service could play that role. Spend a year, you can go into the army, you can go into the Coast Guard, you can help with the national parks, you can teach in the public schools. But it would be important to me to create some moments where these people all spend time together.
I wanted to quote what I take as your conclusion. Modern civilization has given ordinary human beings greater freedom, wealth, and dignity than any before it. It has empowered billions of people in all kinds of ways.
Well, think about it. If I look back to 1900, first of all, my lifespan would be half as long as it's likely to be. I would have died of all kinds of diseases. So you might have been the greatest landowner in the world. I mean, I think, you could have been a great king in the past, and you probably have better dental care today as a working class person. But more importantly, think about the life of women in 1900 versus today. Think of the life of anyone with, non-white colored skin. Think of the life of anybody who came from the lower classes. It's absolutely true. We made a huge amount of progress, and we should be very proud of it. It's a great thing that we've been able to accomplish, and I think it's happened across the world for the most part.
Reading the book, I was struck by the depth of Fareed's optimism. I've talked to a lot of people on this show over the past 2 years, and I think it's rare that they both warned of impending doom and had so much confidence that the world will pull through, that things will be okay. Personally, I just don't know. History's littered with examples where things turned out to be not okay. And while our material conditions may continue to improve, human nature remains pretty stable and is capable of plenty of bad or even evil things. A core strength of Fareed's book is his emphasis that it's not just all a happy march towards happily ever after. We've often been tilting at the edge of a precipice, and we can't take our prosperity, safety, or freedom for granted.
The problem liberal democracy has is it offers you something very simple. It doesn't say you're going to live in paradise forever. It doesn't tell you that you are going to create the most glorious empire in the world. It doesn't tell you you're a superior race than anybody else. It tells you you'll be able to live a nice, ordinary life with a house and a car, and you can do whatever you like in that little bourgeois existence, which I think is a tremendous achievement. But nobody builds cathedrals and goes to war for the right to have a suburban detached home.
Or storms the barricades.
You need somebody rousing you with something. And as Trump showed on January 6th, it can be bad stuff, but it does rouse people to the barricades.
Still, to Fareed, humanity's track record is the best ground for optimism.
I do believe that human beings want to be free. I think that human beings want greater autonomy over their lives, greater dignity for themselves, and that whenever they're given a choice, they do that. For all that we bemoan the breaking up of the churches and religion and things like that, it's all happening because human beings are voluntarily not going to church. Even stuff like the loss of the independent bookstore. Well, it's happening because people are buying books on Amazon. If human beings were not exercising their free choice and to buy books on Amazon and instead walk to their local bookstore, we wouldn't have the problem. So there is a reality here, and we have to recognize that at some level, celebrate it, mitigate some of the downsides of it. But let's not forget, it's a great thing to have choice and freedom and liberty and individual dignity. It's been deprived of most human beings for most of human history. Let's, two cheers for liberty.
If you enjoyed my conversation with Fareed, you can find his new book, Age of Revolutions, on Audible, read by Fareed himself. In the Room with Peter Bergen is an Audible original, produced by Audible Studios and Fresh Produce Media. This episode was produced by Luke Cregan, with help from Nathan Ray. Our executive producer is Alison Craiglow. Katie McMurran is our technical director. Our staff also includes Alexandra Salomon, Eric German, Laura Tillman, Holly DeMuth, Sandy Malera, and JP Swenson. Our theme music is by Joel Picard. Our executive producers for Fresh Produce Media are Colin Moore and Jason Ross. Our head of development is Julian Ambler. Our head of production is Eleanor Bavietz. Maureen Traynor is our head of operations. Our production manager is Herminio Ochoa. Our production coordinator is Henry Koch, and our delivery coordinator is Ana Paula Martinez. Audible's Chief Content Officer is Rachel Giazza, Head of Content Acquisition and Development and Partnerships, Pat Shah, Audible executive producer Lara Regan Kleinschmidt. Special thanks to Marlon Calby, Alison Weber, and Vanessa Harris. Copyright 2024 by Audible Originals, LLC. Sound recording copyright 2024 by Audible Originals, LLC.